December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Dwight Eisenhower was sleeping in his villa in Versailles when the phone rang. The call that would define his command. The call that would test everything he'd learned about leadership, about war, about making decisions when millions of lives hung in the balance. On the other end was Omar Bradley. His voice was tight, controlled, but Eisenhower could hear the tension underneath. German artillery was hammering American positions in the Ardennes forest. Not just a few batteries, thousands of guns. And behind the artillery, infantry, lots of infantry, and tanks. Eisenhower asked a question any commander would ask. How big? Bradley didn't have a good answer yet. Reports were still coming in. Communications were breaking down. But it looked bad, real bad. Eisenhower hung up the phone and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He'd been Supreme Allied Commander for over a year. He'd planned D-Day. He'd liberated France. His armies were pushing toward the Rhine. The war was supposed to be almost over. Germany was beaten. Everyone said so. Intelligence said so. The newspaper said so. But something in Bradley's voice told Eisenhower that everyone might be wrong. Now, before we go any further into what happened next, if you're enjoying these deep dives into the critical moments that change history, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you stories like this every week, the kind of history they don't teach in school, the human decisions behind the big events. All right, let's get back to December 16th, 1944, and the worst day of Eisenhower's war. By noon, the scope of the disaster was becoming clear. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was a full-scale offensive. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men. They'd achieved complete tactical surprise along an 80-mile front. American divisions were being overrun, surrounded, cut off. The 106th Infantry Division, green troops who'd only been in the line for a few days, was getting massacred. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the SHAF compound in Versailles, staff officers moved through the halls with strained faces. Maps were updated every hour, and every update looked worse. Red arrows showing German advances pushed deeper into American positions. Blue unit markers representing American forces kept disappearing. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Walter Bedell Smith, briefed him on what they knew. The Germans had concentrated their attack on the Ardennes sector, the same terrain they'd used to conquer France in 1940. 4 American divisions had been holding a front that should have required 12. The terrain was difficult, heavily forested, with few roads. That's exactly why it had been lightly defended. No one thought the Germans would be crazy enough to attack there in December. If this kind of deep historical analysis is your thing, don't forget to subscribe. We're covering the moments that change history, the human decisions behind the big events, the leadership lessons that still matter today. Hit that subscribe button, and let's keep exploring history together. The Germans had thought differently. Eisenhower looked at the map and asked the critical question, what's their objective? Smith pointed to the town of Bastogne, a critical road junction. If the Germans took Bastogne, they could split the Allied armies. Their ultimate target was probably Antwerp, the port to which most Allied supplies flowed. If they reached Antwerp, they could cut off entire armies from their supply base. The strategic situation was catastrophic, but Eisenhower's response surprised the officers around him. He didn't panic. He didn't rage at the intelligence failure. He looked at that map and saw something different than disaster. He saw opportunity. Think about what Eisenhower was looking at. For months, the German army had been fighting a defensive war, dug into fortifications, making the Allies pay in blood for every mile. German commanders were smart, experienced, careful. They'd been trading space for time, falling back to shorten their lines, husbanding their strength. But now they'd come out of their holes. They committed their reserves to a major offensive. They were exposed. Their supply lines were stretched. If the Allies could respond quickly enough, if they could hit the flanks of the German advance, they could turn this disaster into the decisive battle of the war. That was Eisenhower's gift. He saw the board differently than other men. Where his staff saw a catastrophe, he saw the end game. But seeing opportunity was enough. He had to act on it. and he had maybe 48 hours to make the decisions that would determine whether the German offensive succeeded or failed. December 17th, 1944. Eisenhower made his first critical decision. He needed to see his commanders face to face. Phone calls and radio messages weren't enough. He needed everyone in the same room, looking at the same map, making coordinated decisions. He called for an emergency meeting of all senior Allied commanders. The location would be Verdun, closer to the fighting. The time would be December 19th. That gave everyone 2 days to understand the situation and prepare options. 2 days sounds like a long time when German tanks are advancing, when American soldiers are dying. But Eisenhower understood something about command. Hasty decisions made in panic usually made things worse. He needed 48 hours to let the situation develop, to see where the German main effort was going, to understand what he was really dealing with. While he waited, Eisenhower started making the decisions that only a supreme commander could make. He had to redirect the entire Allied war effort. Offensive operations across the front had to stop. Units had to be pulled out of line and repositioned. The British had to extend their sector to free up American divisions. Reinforcements had to be rushed forward. Supply priorities had to change overnight. Eisenhower called Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group in the North. Montgomery was difficult, egotistical, careful to the point of caution, but he was also professional. Eisenhower told him to prepare to extend British lines and take command of American forces north of the German breakthrough if communications were cut. That decision would become controversial. American generals resented putting American troops under British command. But Eisenhower wasn't worried about egos. If the Germans split the Allied front, someone had to command the northern sector. Montgomery was positioned to do it. The decision was operationally sound, even if it was politically difficult. Next, Eisenhower called for reinforcements. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were in reserve, resting after the disaster at Market Garden. He ordered both divisions to move immediately to the Ardennes. They'd go in without their normal equipment, without proper winter gear, without full ammunition loads. It didn't matter. Bodies were needed at critical points. The airborne could move fast and fight hard. He stripped divisions from other sectors. The 7th Armored Division, the 10th Armored Division, anything that could move went toward the breakthrough. Eisenhower was gambling that the Germans wouldn't launch secondary attacks elsewhere. If they did, other parts of the line would collapse. But he didn't think they would. This offensive had to be everything Germany had left. They'd committed their strategic reserve. This was their last roll of the dice. Eisenhower also made a decision that would prove critical. He refused a retreat. Some staff officers suggested pulling back to shorten the line, to establish more defensible positions. Eisenhower said no. Every town, every road junction, every village had to be held as long as possible. The longer American forces delayed the German advance, the more time Eisenhower had to organize a counterattack. That decision would doom some American units. The 101st Airborne would end up surrounded at Bastogne. The 106th Infantry Division would be virtually destroyed. Men would die because Eisenhower ordered them to hold positions that couldn't be held. But those men would buy time. And time was what Eisenhower needed. December 18th. The situation got worse before it got better. German spearheads were advancing faster than American reinforcements could arrive. The weather was terrible, freezing fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force that had been virtually absent for months, suddenly appeared in strength. They'd been hoarding fuel and aircraft for this offensive. Reports came in of German soldiers wearing American uniforms, speaking English, cutting communication lines, misdirecting traffic, spreading confusion. Otto Skorzny's commandos were operating behind American lines. Rumors spread that German assassins were targeting Allied commanders. Security around Eisenhower was increased. He hated it, felt like a prisoner in his own headquarters, but he accepted it. The German plan was becoming clearer. They were driving for the Meuse River, trying to reach it before Allied reinforcements could establish a defensive line. If they crossed the Meuse, they had a shot at Antwerp. The offensive might actually work. Eisenhower studied the reports and made another critical decision. Bastogne had to hold. That road junction was the key to the entire German advance. 7 roads met at Bastogne. The Germans needed those roads to move their armor forward. If Bastogne could be held, if the 101st Airborne could hang on there, the German offensive would be channeled into narrow corridors that could be hit from the flanks. He called Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 18 Airborne Corps. The 101st was being rushed to Bastogne. They had to get there first, before the Germans closed the ring. Ridgway understood. The paratroopers made it. Barely. Within hours, Bastogne was surrounded. Now came the hard part. Eisenhower had positioned his pieces. He'd rushed reinforcements forward. He'd established command arrangements. He'd identified the critical terrain. Now he had to coordinate a counterattack that would stop the German advance and destroy the attacking forces. That required getting all his commanders together, getting them to agree on a plan, getting them to execute that plan with speed and precision. And some of those commanders hated each other. December 19, 1944. A converted French army barracks in Verdun. The room was cold despite a struggling stove in the corner. The most powerful generals in the Allied command filed in, took seats around a table covered with maps. Bernard Montgomery, proud and prickly. Omar Bradley, Eisenhower's old friend, furious that the Germans had broken through a sector. George Patton, aggressive and confident. Jacob Devers, commanding in the South. Air commanders, staff officers, intelligence analysts. Not one of them was smiling. The situation reports kept getting worse. The Germans were still advancing. American casualties were mounting. The weather was preventing air support. This was the worst crisis the Allies had faced since D-Day. Eisenhower walked into the room and immediately took control. He prepared his remarks carefully. He knew his commanders were angry, frustrated, looking for someone to blame. He had to change the mood or this meeting would turn into a disaster. He started with words that surprised everyone in the room. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not a disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table. The generals stared at him. Opportunity? The Germans had just achieved complete surprise, shattered for American divisions, and were driving toward the Meuse. How was that an opportunity? Eisenhower explained his thinking, and this is where you see the difference between a good commander and a great one. He told his generals that the German army had finally come out of its defensive positions. For months, the Allies had been bashing their heads against fortified lines, taking casualties, making slow progress. The Germans had been smart, falling back, trading space for time, making the Allies pay for every yard. But now the Germans had committed their strategic reserve to an offensive. They were exposed. Their supply lines were stretched. They'd put their neck in a noose. If the Allies could respond quickly, if they could hit the flanks of the German advance, they could destroy the best units Germany had left. This could be the battle that ended the war. The psychology of that statement was brilliant. Eisenhower took a room full of defeated, angry generals and reframed the entire situation. This wasn't a disaster. This was exactly what they needed. The enemy had made a mistake, and now the Allies were going to make them pay for it. But reframing wasn't enough. Eisenhower needed plans. He needed his generals to tell him how they were going to turn disaster into victory. He looked at the map and asked a critical question. How soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? The room went quiet. Generals studied maps, calculated distances, considered logistics. Moving an army wasn't like moving a division. It required coordinating thousands of vehicles, establishing supply lines, disengaging units from current operations, planning routes, positioning artillery. It took time. Then George Patton spoke. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals turned and stared at him. Montgomery's face showed open skepticism. Bradley looked confused. Some thought Patton was grandstanding, making promises he couldn't keep. 48 hours to disengage divisions from active combat, rotate an entire army 90 degrees, move over 100,000 men through snow and ice, and launch a coordinated attack. It was operationally impossible. Eisenhower had known Patton for decades. He knew when Patton was bluffing and when he was serious. He studied Patton's face and saw complete confidence, not bravado. Confidence based on preparation. Eisenhower pressed him. "George, this is no time for grandstanding. The 101st Airborne is surrounded. If we promise relief and can't deliver, those men die." Patton didn't blink. "Ike, I've already given the orders. Third Army is disengaging now. I have 3 contingency plans prepared. I've been expecting this attack for 11 days. Now the room exploded. Expecting it? How could Patton have expected an attack that caught SAF intelligence completely by surprise? And here's where Eisenhower had to make his second critical decision in 48 hours. Did he trust Patton? Patton was aggressive, sometimes reckless, prone to making bold promises. But Patton was also one of the best operational commanders in the American Army. If Patton said he could attack in 48 hours, maybe he really could. Eisenhower made his decision. "All right, George, get moving." That decision, made in maybe 30 seconds, would determine whether Bastogne could be relieved, whether the 101st Airborne would survive, whether the German offensive would succeed or fail. But Eisenhower wasn't done. He turned to Montgomery and told him to prepare an attack from the north once the German advance had been stopped. Montgomery agreed, though with his usual caution about proper preparation and adequate supplies. Eisenhower listened, nodded, but everyone in the room understood. The main counterattack was Patton's. Montgomery would clean up afterward. Eisenhower laid out the overall strategy. Hold Bastogne, stop the German advance at the Meuse, hit the flanks of the German penetration from north and south, destroy the attacking forces, then resume the advance toward Germany. The meeting lasted hours. Details were hammered out, boundaries established, supply priorities set, communication protocols confirmed. But the critical decisions had been made in the first hour. Patton would attack toward Bastogne. Montgomery would command in the north. The Allies would not retreat. After the meeting, Eisenhower pulled Bradley aside. Bradley was upset, embarrassed that the Germans had achieved surprise in his sector, angry that some of his forces would be placed under Montgomery's command. Eisenhower told him something important. This wasn't about egos or reputations. This was about winning the war. Bradley was a good soldier. He accepted it. Now Eisenhower had to wait. He'd made his decisions. He'd given his orders. The next 48 hours would tell him if those decisions were right. December 20th and 21st. The Battle of the Bulge reached its crisis point. German spearheads reached within 4 miles of the Meuse River. American forces were stretched to the breaking point. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was completely surrounded, low on ammunition, low on food, low on medical supplies. But Patton's Third Army was moving. Over 133,000 vehicles displacing through snow and ice. Artillery batteries repositioning. Infantry divisions disengaging from combat and marching north. Tank formations navigating narrow roads in the worst winter weather in decades. It was the largest, fastest redeployment of an army in American military history. And it was happening because Eisenhower had trusted Patton's promise. December 22nd, 3rd Army attacked. The 4th Armored Division drove north toward Bastogne. The fighting was brutal. Every mile was contested. But they were moving. That same day, the Germans sent an ultimatum to the 101st Airborne. Surrender or be annihilated. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back his famous one-word reply. Nuts. The paratroopers weren't giving up. They knew Patton was coming. Eisenhower received reports of fighting and made another decision. He ordered the weather forecasters to give him a prediction for flying weather. They told him a high-pressure system was moving in. The skies would clear on December 23rd. That meant Allied aircraft to fly. Thousands of them. Fighters, bombers, supply planes. The Germans had gambled that winter weather would ground the Allied air forces. That gamble was about to fail. December 23rd. The weather cleared. Allied aircraft filled the sky. They bombed German supply columns, attacked German positions, dropped supplies to Bastogne. The Luftwaffe tried to contest the air but was overwhelmed. American and British pilots had been waiting for this. They savaged the German formations. On the ground, Patton's forces continued to push north. The 4th Armored Division was making slow, bloody progress. Every village was a battle. Every road junction was defended, but they were getting closer to Bastogne. December 26, 1944. 4:50 in the afternoon, First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead tank of the 4th Armored Division, pushed through the last German positions and made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. Eisenhower received the news and felt relief for the first time in 10 days. Bastogne had held. Patton had delivered. The German offensive had been stopped, but the battle wasn't over. The Germans were still fighting, still trying to break through. Eisenhower's next decision was whether to simply contain the German penetration or to try to destroy the attacking forces. He chose destruction. Montgomery would attack from the north. Patton would continue to drive from the south. The Germans would be caught in a vice and annihilated. It took another month. The Germans fought with skill and desperation, but they were doomed. Their supply lines were cut. Their fuel was gone. Allied aircraft hunted them day and night. By late January, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The casualties were staggering. Over 19,000 Americans killed, over 47,000 wounded, another 23,000 captured or missing. The bloodiest battle the American Army fought in World War II. But the German losses were worse. Over 100,000 casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed, aircraft losses that could never be replaced. Germany had committed its last strategic reserve and lost it. The war would continue for another 4 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany had gambled everything on the Ardennes offensive and lost. After the battle, military historians studied Eisenhower's decisions during those critical 48 hours. The decision to meet with all commanders face to face. The decision to refuse retreat. The decision to trust Patton's promise. The decision to focus on Bastogne. The decision to counterattack rather than simply contain. Every one of those decisions was correct, but they were only correct because Eisenhower understood something that other commanders sometimes forgot. War isn't fought on maps. It's fought by men. And leading men requires understanding their capabilities, trusting their judgment, coordinating their efforts. Eisenhower's gift wasn't tactical brilliance. Patton was a better tactician. Montgomery was more careful. Bradley was more methodical. But Eisenhower was a better commander because he understood how to get all those different personalities working toward the same objective. At Verdun, facing the worst crisis of his command, Eisenhower didn't panic. He didn't issue detailed tactical orders. He didn't micromanage. He set the strategic direction, gave his commanders their objectives, trusted them to figure out how to achieve those objectives, and held them accountable for results. That's leadership. That's why the Allies won the Battle of the Bulge. Not because of any single decision, but because Eisenhower made dozens of correct decisions in 48 hours while under enormous pressure. German commanders after the war admitted that Eisenhower's response surprised them. They'd expected confusion, delay, hesitation. They got coordinated counterattacks within days. They calculated it would take the Allies at least a week to mount a serious response. Patton hit them in 4 days. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding the German forces, was asked after the war what had defeated the Ardennes offensive. He gave a simple answer: Eisenhower's decision-making and Allied air power. The air power came from clear skies, but the decision-making came from a man who understood that commanding armies required more than moving pins on maps. It required seeing opportunity in disaster. It required trusting subordinates. It required coordinating complex operations under pressure. It required making decisions with incomplete information and accepting responsibility for the consequences. That's what Eisenhower did in 48 hours in December 1944. He decided the fate of the Battle of the Bulge, not with one brilliant decision, but with a series of correct decisions that built on each other, that positioned Allied forces to turn disaster into victory. And that's the lesson of those 48 hours. Leadership isn't about never making mistakes. It's about making more correct decisions and incorrect ones when everything is on the line. It's about seeing the situation clearly when others are panicking. It's about trusting your people while holding them accountable. It's about making the hard calls and living with the consequences. Eisenhower made the hard calls. Thousands of American soldiers died because of decisions he made. The 106th Infantry Division was virtually destroyed. Men froze to death in foxholes defending positions that couldn't be held. Those deaths were on Eisenhower's conscience for the rest of his life. But those sacrifices bought time for the counterattack that destroyed Germany's last offensive capability and shortened the war. Eisenhower understood that terrible calculus. That's what command means at the highest levels. 48 hours at the brink. That's what it took to decide the fate of the Battle of the Bulge. 48 hours of decisions that required seeing clearly, acting decisively, trusting wisely, and accepting responsibility completely. That's why Dwight Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander. Not because he was perfect, but because when it mattered most, he made the decisions that needed to be made. And that's how the Battle of the Bulge was won.